Hi, everybody. Good Monday afternoon to you, and happy almost spring break. Here at the end of African American History Month and at the dawn, by the time you get back and toward the end of this week of the beginning of Women's History Month, we're having an intersectional speaker who's going to talk once again about American values, particularly as they pertain to sexuality and gender designation, and I will leave all of that to Dr. Marisa Richmond, who is in the history department here at MTSU. Dr. Richmond's undergraduate degree is from Harvard. She has a master's from University of California, Berkeley, and her PhD in history is from George Washington University. Her focus is on 20th century U.S. politics, and here at MTSU, she is a member of both the history department and the Women and Gender Study program. She is so active politically in our community. You talk about a faculty member who is out there in the community engaging with the community at all times. This is one of the most active women in our entire campus. She holds offices nationally and statewide. She's currently on the Metro Nashville-Davidson County Commission on Human Relations. She is a member at large of the National Democratic National Committee, and she is a founding member and the first president of the Tennessee Transgender Political Coalition here in the state of Tennessee, and fresh out of probably teaching a survey class just only moments ago, someplace else on campus, I give you Dr. Marisa Richmond.
Thank you. Is this on? Is that on? No? Okay. That's fine. Yeah, I just got out of a 2010 class over in BAS. And so I was actually going to lead with what I just finished with in that class just a few minutes ago, which is the Constitution of the United States, although we were just up to the writing of it, the Constitutional Convention of 1787. But I specifically wanted to mention one of the subsequent amendments even past the Bill of Rights, and this is the 14th Amendment. Ratified by the states shortly after the end of the Civil War. And in Section 1, the last sentence of Section 1 is particularly important, that nor shall any state deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And those who've taken me, especially in the 2020 class where we do talk about the 14th Amendment, I point out that's the first and only time that the word equal appears in the entire Constitution. Of course, those stirring words, all men are created equal, appear in the Declaration of Independence, a statement of principle, and it's good that our nation was founded on such a principle, although we've fought many, many battles since 1776 to try to ensure that those words really mean something and that we really do all share in equality. But we did have to fight a civil war before we could even add that last phrase, equal protection of the laws, to the Constitution of the United States. And so certainly in my academic career as well as in my outside political activities, one of the things I've tried to do is to make those words a reality for all, because I do inherently believe in them. Of course, before we started talking about the Constitution, I also talked about freedom of religion. And we specifically looked just an hour ago at Virginia's Statute on Religious Liberties, which brought freedom of religion to the state of Virginia. And in that document, Thomas Jefferson, who was the author of it, laid out his belief that you should not require people to pay through government taxes to support any faith, and nor should there be any ban on any faith serving in our communities. And many states, when the country was founded, had such bans on Jews, on Muslims, and certainly atheists. Some also banned Catholics from participating in politics and government. So we fought many battles over the years to ensure those words, equal protection of the laws, both before and certainly after that. And in my own field of history and study and teaching, we've looked at many of those battles and many of the challenges that so many people face. So of course, I'm here today to talk about the role of equality and the fight for equality, specifically on behalf of the LGBT community, because those battles are certainly continuing. And I even just saw this morning, just before I went to class, that there was a brand new ruling from the U.S. Second Circuit Court of Appeals saying that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does cover sexual orientation, banning discrimination against gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. And there were already previous rulings on Title VII, which again says ban sex discrimination, covering transgender people. And so, you know, if we believe in the concept of civil rights, if we believe in the concept of equal protection of the law, we have to stand up for all of these many groups. If we believe in freedom of religion, as stated by Virginia in 1786, and as included both in Article 6 of the Constitution and the First Amendment of the Constitution, if we believe in those things, then we have to make sure that all Americans, including LGBTQ Americans, share in the benefits of the Constitution and of federal law. Of course, the Civil Rights Act in 1964 was a culmination of many years of struggle by African Americans, as was the 14th Amendment in a century earlier, to try to ban discrimination. And of course, even with the 14th Amendment and the Reconstruction era laws, that discrimination certainly continued. Of course, during the 1960s, we see both the Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, excuse me, and the Open Housing Act of 1968. We still find that as we look to ensure equal protection of the laws, that many people are denied equal protection of the laws, that it is still appropriate in many states, including Tennessee, to fire an LGBTQ person simply because they are an LGBTQ person. It is still acceptable in Tennessee to deny a person equal access to housing or shelters in the event of an emergency. And of course, Title IX, which affects us here in education, not just higher ed, but K through 12 as well, we're seeing battles over the use of Title IX, which also bans sex discrimination in schools. We're seeing how many LGBTQ people are still being denied equal access to education, that many people feel it's appropriate to discriminate in schools, continue to not hire LGBTQ people for teachers and staff and faculty and university presidents. Oh, Dr. Maffei's not here. So we're seeing those battles continue to play out. And so what the LGBTQ community has done and continues to do, and will probably continue to do for many years to come, is continue to highlight those federal laws, those pre-existing laws, and to highlight the language in the Constitution and fight those battles in the courts in the same way that African Americans fought those battles in the courts, as we saw through the success of the Brown decision. It wasn't the end of the story. It was just a stage in the story for those of us in the African American community to end discrimination in education. And there were many places where they thought it was appropriate to deny opportunity to blacks, despite those words, equal protection of the laws. And many of them were basing it on the religious beliefs, despite the fact that the First Amendment was there and Article 6 says specifically, no religious test for office shall ever be required. But yet many people would continue to apply certain religious tests and certainly racial identities to allowing a person to hold certain positions or to be in certain places. My dad was a graduate of the University of Kansas because he was from Kansas. And in high school, he was the high school track star. At least that's what he claimed. That's what he told me. The photos, I could see my dad, and then there was nobody else around him. And I said, "You're last." He goes, "No, I'm first." But when he went to the University of Kansas, even though he had been a state resident, my great-grandparents moved to Kansas in 1884. They'd been taxpayers for decades. When he went to the University of Kansas, he was not allowed to live in a campus dorm. He had to live in an off-campus co-op. And he was not allowed to run on the university track team, even though he was clearly good enough. And that's because their conference, at that time was the Big Six, included 2 Jim Crow states, Oklahoma and Missouri, and they had a no black rule, not only for their teams, but part of these so-called gentleman agreements, although I'd argue those were asshole agreements, that they would not even compete against black athletes. So my dad was denied that opportunity during World War II, when the United States was overseas fighting fascism and discrimination. And yet he was denied opportunity in his own home state at a school paid for by his own family's tax money. And so, you know, these battles certainly resonate with many groups in society, and that's on top of the internment of Japanese Americans at the time. So these battles to ensure those words, equal protection of the laws, applies to so many groups. And so when we look at the LGBTQ community today, since I just came out of class, I'm dehydrated. So what we're seeing is these other groups are now fighting for their part of society, for their recognition, for their opportunities. I was too young when the Stonewall riots and the other riots of the 1960s took place. I don't remember them at all, although I think I was in England on the day of the Stonewall riots. So I was getting very little U.S. news at the time. But that riot is similar to the other riots that were taking place and other protests and battles taking place by blacks and Native Americans in the late 60s and early 70s, saying, we're tired of harassment, we're tired of discrimination. And certainly in one of the classes I teach in Women's and Gender Studies, we look at one of those riots of the 60s, specifically one in San Francisco. And before we even get to that, we look at the state of the LGBTQ community and the challenges that they face leading up to those riots, so we understand them a lot better. And so when we look at those movements, especially since the 60s, we understand first, the context of all of those riots, especially the Stonewall riot, and saying we're sick and tired of harassment. And that was triggered by the police. Police harassment going into bars in those days, arresting people who are either holding hands with a same-sex partner or sitting a little too closely, too intimately, or sometimes even dancing together. A lot of times people got around that by having one woman surrounded by 6 men, and then she could say, they're all my dance partners when the police raid would take place. And that was a way of avoiding people getting arrested for dancing. And so you can understand, if you were to have to put up with that sort of harassment, why people would fight back. And it's a logical means of standing up for your rights, especially since those rights are already there, or already supposed to be protected if we stand behind the Constitution. But too many times we have not. And that's why we had to have that second Reconstruction for the black community in the 1960s. And the LGBT community is one of many that was inspired by that civil rights movement to say, these words apply to us too, because equal means everybody. Equal doesn't mean some. You can't have equality for some people. That's called special privileges. Equality does mean everyone, and there's no other way to define the word equal. Because if any group is superior to another, if any group is denied opportunity, then there is no equality. Not now, not ever. So as we look at the LGBTQ community's movement, we see this emphasis kind of based on what Dr. Martin Luther King said in the I Have a Dream speech. When you dissect the language of that speech, he's talking about core American beliefs and values dating back to the Declaration of Independence. It's an articulation of the American dream, and everybody wants the same things. They want to be able to get a decent job with decent wages and decent conditions and benefits. Everyone wants to be able to take care of their family, raise that family in a decent home, free of fear of violence and crime. They want to have, again, a good opportunity to share in all American values and all American opportunities. So when we look at, and the LGBT community certainly has faced a great deal of hostility, largely based on religion, but if you profess to believe in the values embedded in the Constitution and in American law, and again, dating back to the principles and ideals of the Declaration, then you can only assume one thing, that LGBT values are American values, since it's the title. And so when we look at the nature of these battles, whether it's going through the courts or going through legislatures, going through executive branch policies or appointments, it's part of that effort to share in the American dream and to see these values articulated and spread for all groups and all Americans. Certainly, the controversies are not going away anytime soon, and certainly what we've seen over the last year or so, increased battles in the courts, leading to decisions like the one today over sexual orientation in workplace discrimination. That was specifically a workplace case, because that's what Title VII largely addresses. As I said, open housing is housing, Title IX is education, Medicare and Medicaid, there have been battles over that. But those laws also contain sex discrimination language, which denies equal opportunity to people in healthcare, and especially since virtually every medical doctor, every hospital in the whole country accepts Medicare money. It's just, there's too much of it out there. And one day, if we haven't gotten rid of Medicare, you'll find out firsthand. I'm a lot closer to it than you all. But the idea is that each and every person is supposed to have access, because we're Americans and we've all contributed to it, or some of us are contributing to a little more than others maybe, but it is a program for each and every person. And when I hear stories of people being turned away from shelters or being turned away from hospitals, I get angry and I get frustrated for them. I'm fortunate that, as was noted by Dr. Evans, I've appointed to the Metro Nashville Human Relations Commission. I'm serving a 3-year term. I'm now in year 2. I'm up for renomination next year, although if you've been following the news, I don't know which mayor will decide whether or not I get renominated. But I can serve a maximum of 2 terms. But we've covered quite a number of issues at that time, including some LGBTQ issues. The commission was founded initially to address discrimination and harassment of blacks, especially by the police, and because that's what triggered the Nashville race riot of 1967. And we've continued to have issues between the black and police communities for many years since then. But our role has expanded, and one of the things, just last month, we had 2 young transgender men who work for Metro Nashville government came and said, well, why can't I get full health care benefits? You know, I've served Metro Nashville, ironically, both in the police department, and they said the insurance policy provides specific exclusions for us as transgender people. So now we're looking into that, saying, well, if you've served your community, you work hard, why shouldn't you have full health care benefits like everybody else? Whatever you may need is prescribed by your doctor should be covered by that health care benefit plan. And the idea that even here in the 21st century, in the year 2018, hardworking government employees could be told we're not going to cover certain health care treatments simply because of your identity, that's just blatant discrimination. That's not equal protection of the law. And so the commission, that's one of the things that we and similar commissions around the country are looking at and trying to address. Oh, didn't know I'd be so dehydrated today. Any questions, comments so far? Yes. Hi.
So LGBT tends to be, for better or worse, lumped together into one category generally. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what are specific challenges that the transgender community faces in terms of equal rights and equal protection?
Well, for starters, healthcare, that's seems to be more of an issue, because the exclusions that these 2 men were talking about were specific to their being transgender, and that the healthcare plan, in many places, we're up to 111 cities that have full coverage, but Nashville's not one of those 111. And so there are certain issues that are specific to trans health that were excluded that most other people don't deal with. We also see, although this is more state level, a lot of issues related to documentation. the state of Tennessee is currently the only state in the whole country with a law that bans gender changes on birth certificates. That was passed in 1977, and here we are 41 years later, and not one state has seen the wisdom in passing a similar law. So Tennessee remains alone. Most people don't think about changing documents, but transgender people do. And so, those are some of the major concerns. The intersex community is also particularly concerned about that birth certificate law because it bans them from changing it either. And so even though there's some overlaps between the two communities, there are a lot of differences, but that's one of those areas of overlapping interests. Yes?
I would like to know if that 1977 Tennessee law on the books, is that one that's takeable to the U.S. Supreme Court?
The ACLU is working on a lawsuit. I've been told, I was originally told they were planning to file in November 2015. They're a little behind schedule. The last I talked to an ACLU lawyer, I was at a party, and I don't know how many glasses of wine he had, but the lawyers told me they're looking at March of this year, which starts Thursday. So I haven't talked to him since that party. But the plan is to file a lawsuit, although what they said was that they were planning to file in state court. I don't have my state constitution's over there in my purse, but the state constitution has more protections for right of privacy than the U.S. Constitution does. We do have that language in Article 4, in Fourth Amendment, but the Tennessee language is a bit stronger. So they are planning to file a lawsuit in state court, and then if they have to, cross over to the U.S. Federal courts. But since we're the only state with such a law, there's not really any precedent for going forward. But they're using right to privacy because if you have to pull that document out, you're exposing yourself and you're outing yourself. And thus that violates your right to privacy, that you're forced to identify yourself in a way that you may not want people to know. And that's the strategy going forward.
Well, what about those other Tennessee laws that you mentioned that permit housing and employment discrimination? What Tennessee laws are those?
Well, not specifically permit. Tennessee's never banned discrimination. There have been bills to do so, but they've never passed. However, the state has passed language that would permit they don't use the word discrimination. They try to couch this as religious freedom. But the courts have consistently said you can't discriminate on the basis of religion. Religious institutions are exempted, but a person by themselves cannot hide their bigotry behind religion. But the state of Tennessee has said that they can. And so there was a counseling law passed a couple years ago. This triggered multiple protests and boycotts by several states, including California and Washington State. Although I noted last year during the NCAA tournament, they were in Memphis and a California school went and participated anyway. So they didn't even honor their own boycott. I guess basketball takes precedence, huh? But so Tennessee has been very careful to couch it in that way to avoid a federal lawsuit. So they don't say you can discriminate or you must discriminate. So they sort of couch the language in such a way that so far there have not been any successful legal challenges to those current state laws. And that's the thing. We're seeing multiple states pass laws. I think in terms of employment and housing, we're up to 18 to 20 states. Puerto Rico is also as one of the territories. District of Columbia. Tennessee has kind of moved in the opposite direction. While the federal government has passed, and again, the federal government hasn't passed anything, although we did see we've seen some court rulings, we've seen legal interpretations from the previous presidential administration, specifically over Title VII, Title IX, HUD, Medicare, but the current administration is rolling back all of those. They're even basically trying to argue Title IX doesn't even cover cisgender women in schools, that there's no bullying or harassment or assault of women that's covered by Title IX in colleges and universities around the country. And so they're cutting back in that area. They're not just targeting the LGBTQ community. As far as I'm concerned, that should be of concern to each and every person here. Well, it all should be anyway. The federal government has passed hate crimes laws covering LGBTQ community, and there are about 10 states that have full coverage as well. Tennessee is not one of them. Sexual orientation is in the Tennessee law, but gender identity or expression, which is the language for trans people, is not. And Tennessee has not yet added that language to the state law, but it is in federal law, and that kind of puts TBI kind of in a bind because they have to report to the federal government through the FBI, U.S. Department of Justice. So they're told by the federal government they have to include certain categories, even though the state of Tennessee has refused to add those categories to state law, to state requirements. There was a couple years ago a trans woman in Cookeville whose truck was burned, and then a political statement was painted on the side of her truck. And the Putnam County Sheriff says, well, this isn't a hate crime. And because the victim was transgender by Tennessee law, he's correct. It's not a hate crime. But it is under federal law. And he's still obligated to enforce federal law as well as state law. And I thought it was rather disappointing, his reaction to that particular incident in Cookeville. And again, that's only like a year and a half, 2 years ago, something like that. Very recent. So, you know, we're seeing a lack of enforcement of laws that do exist. Again, differences of opinion in interpreting that language. And again, we do have sex discrimination in multiple federal laws right now. And as we're seeing, just like I said today in the Second Circuit Court, increased interpretation that sex discrimination covers some or all of the LGBT community, but yet that discrimination continues. We've also seen cases where employees will put, businesses will put language in their policies and then continue the discrimination. It's easy to say we're going to not discriminate until someone comes along and then they suddenly say, well, we didn't really mean you. You know, we just were banning discrimination against all those sort of invisible people as long as they stay invisible. But once someone actually comes out, that becomes an issue. And to hit it home, I was talking to a woman 2 or 3 years ago who worked at the TBR headquarters after Tennessee Board of Regents passed a non-discrimination policy. And she came out of the closet and they fired her because they didn't want her there after they had adopted the policy. And so she can't say anything publicly, but I can on her behalf because I know of the incident. And you know, they were being hypocritical, and we see this time and time and time again. And another employer, a private company, I won't name the company, they too adopted a policy, and then one of their senior engineers came out of the closet and they freaked out. It's like, you've already got the policy in place, you know, work with the person. And they're like, but no, she has to do it our way. It's like, no, that's not what non-discrimination means. You support her, not the other way around. She's worked for you, she's earned money for your company, you're a multi-million-dollar international corporation. If you're going to adopt this language, then you apply it to everybody. And there have been lawsuits already filed against a number of companies that have policies, including Saks Fifth Avenue and Walmart. And they too have these policies, but yet after they did so, their employees continued to face discrimination, and they finally had to take their own employers to court to end the discrimination. And that discrimination can apply in all sorts of ways, to outright firing, to isolation, refusal to promote. One person at a company in Wisconsin was told that she could use the next nearest bathroom, which was a half-mile away from her building. And there were a couple of times she didn't make it. You know, it's not just sending her to a different floor, but to a different building. So these sorts of things continue to happen all around the country. And I don't know if that particular company had a policy or not, but I learned of her particular case. You know, and you know, we're all just trying to run down the hall sometimes just to get to a bathroom. Imagining having to get in a car and drive half a mile and not making it. And you know, we're all adults, and I think we'd all be horrified if any of that happened to us, and it happened to her. And she was outraged, and justifiably so. So Although I've already sort of opened it up to questions, I don't want to take the entire time, so I'd like whatever additional questions at this additional time, just devote it to questions, whatever, or comments. You don't have to ask a question if you just want to make a statement, because you have the right to speak up, freedom of speech, although under the Fifth Amendment, you also have the right to remain silent. I always remind my students of all your constitutional rights. Yes, in the back row.
I know that workplaces, when they're dealing with new hires, they often ask about mode of transportation in order to discriminate against people who are of the lower income bracket. What about preferred name? I've noticed a trend that would also discriminate against people in the trans and intersex community.
I haven't seen specifically the preferred name discrimination. It probably is there. One of the things we've noticed, they will ask you, have you had a different name? And so that outs a lot of, especially transgender people. If they graduate from a college that does not change transcripts, that is something they have to carry for the rest of their lives. And so those are the sorts of things that would out them. I haven't heard specifically, do you prefer a name or what have you, and discriminate, but there are ways of discriminating a person based on name. Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned like the way that people will use religious justification to discriminate. How exactly do you, like, I don't know if you can't necessarily convince them otherwise, but how do you even discuss the issue with them?
Well, like I said, I mean, our rights are based on this document. You know, you can believe what you want to believe, but you cannot allow to impose your religion on anybody else. Now, if an organization, a business, is run by a church, it's affiliated with the church, that's one thing. And if the church policy states certain things, then that business should be allowed to abide by that. But it's the individual, and this is coming up in a Supreme Court case now called Masterpiece Cake versus the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. And Masterpiece, the owner, is religious, but the bakery, it's a bakery, they're not affiliated with a religious institution. So the owner is trying to apply his religious beliefs to a potential customer and saying, I will not make cakes for a same-sex marriage ceremony. And again, under the Civil Rights Act of '64, you can't do that. If it's a public facility, then it has to be open to everybody equally. And if you make cakes for weddings, then and same-sex marriages have been legal in Colorado for several years, even before the Supreme Court ruled on it in 2015, then you cannot discriminate against that couple. And you can't deny them that business service because the business is not religious. The individual is.
I got more of a comment to whoever asked that question last. In my previous place of employment, I heard about it through the grapevine. About 6 months later, the owner was heavily religious Christian owner, and it was a very, very small company, and he made everyone pray, but there was one engineer that refused to, and he was fired. He ended up filing a lawsuit, and he won the case. So.
Okay, I hadn't heard that particular case, but yeah. Yeah, well, obviously here we're a public university. So needless to say, under the First Amendment as a public university, we are not here to impose any religion on anybody. So I tell my students, every time I give a test, people are praying, oh, Lord, help me. And so, it happens here, even in public universities. And I also tell my students, and a couple are in this room right now, that if you have to be out for a religious reason, the First Amendment guarantees you that protection. So if you have to go to an orgy in the forest, that's your business. I am not the one that's going to keep you from something that important because that's your religious faith and I can't define that for you. And so I'm not here to impose whatever my religious beliefs are on anybody else. I am simply going to respect what your religious beliefs are, and it's up to you to tell me what they are, not for me to define them for you. And that's the way it should be everywhere, not just in public schools.
I'm just curious, when companies have policies trying to be inclusive of LGBT people, is there anything in the language that acknowledges their degree or level of outness?
There may be in certain individual companies. I'm not aware of anything specific. There is what's called a corporate equality index by a group called the Human Rights Campaign. And so they give out scores to all these companies, although some, like Walmart, got 100 and they still got sued. And so, so there are different categories. And cities are also measured. So there's the Municipal Equality Index. But specifically for the Corporate Equality Index, there are all these different categories, and you get a certain score, certain number of points for each category. But I haven't noticed whether they specifically asked that or if any company has that distinction within their policies. By the way, on the corporate equality, or the municipal, Nashville, we had the highest score in the state of Tennessee. We were 60, a D minus. Of the 8 cities measured, Murfreesboro was last with 12. I was actually somebody from here in Rutherford County. I live in Davidson, but somebody was saying, I can't believe that. That's horrible. Franklin's ahead of Murfreesboro. We got to do something about that. Okay, I thought it was funny. Yes.
How is the burning of the car and like the vandalism not considered a hate crime?
Well, like I said, the victim was transgender, and the state does not include transgender people in the current law. So by definition, that sheriff was correct, if you want to take that strictly. But as far as I'm concerned, vandalism of a person's property for any reason, and since there was a political message placed on the vehicle after it was burned, clearly that person was targeting this individual for a particular reason, was trying to send a political message. And by my definition, that would still make it a hate crime. And so Tennessee law has like 17 categories. And so somewhere in there, we should be able to find a definition of a hate crime based on one of those existing 17 for that particular case. But because the victim is trans and that group is not included, that gave the sheriff the out.
You said that the sheriff followed the state law and not the federal law, federal definition. Which one are they legally required to follow?
Either one that applies. When government employees, they swear to uphold both the state and federal constitution, state and federal law. So they can't pick and choose. Sheriff Hall in Davidson County has been criticized by the Latino community for abiding with certain federal laws, and he says, I have to do so. I can't choose back and forth. And so, if Sheriff Hall says federal and state law apply to me, then the sheriff of Putnam County is under the same rules. Anyone? Yes.
What can we do to eradicate this injustice?
Well, we have elections coming up this year, you might have noticed. Starters, April 5th is the deadline to run, if any of you want to run for office. Local offices, I know we just passed the deadline for the May 1st races, but there's still plenty on the ballot in August, and April 5th is that deadline. So state legislature, some people may be interested in running for state legislature. If you do get elected, don't forget that our university professors need higher salaries. Or you can get behind a candidate. I'm not here to endorse anyone, but you can get behind a candidate. Of course, the state capitol's 30 miles away in Nashville. We got spring break next week. Got plenty of time to go out there and hang out, knock on doors, and talk to legislators. Their political groups. For the LGBT community, there are 2 statewide groups, Tennessee Equality Project and Tennessee Transgender Political Coalition. So you can join either one of those groups if you are focused on those issues, but there are other groups focused on race and women's rights. Obviously, guns have become a major topic of discussion in the last few days. There are groups working on those issues, um, funding for all sorts of issues. In Nashville, we're dealing with transit, but I drive from Nashville to Murfreesboro, and then I'm heading back to Nashville after this. And there's traffic. I don't have to tell you that. There are potholes, and so those are issues that affect you too. And so I don't know what your number one issue may be, but there's all sorts of organizations working on these issues, and contact those organizations. I had a young woman in one of my classes who was just devoted to Planned Parenthood a few years ago, and she still volunteers at Planned Parenthood, and she's just graduating this semester. I guess she's a senior now, and so that's her passion. And so whatever your passion is, get involved, and go to the state capitol, go to Washington, D.C. Although your members of Congress, Lamar Alexander and Bob Corker, have offices in Nashville in the same building, and the congressman is Scott Desjardins. And so he has an office right here in the courthouse square, a block from the courthouse. And so whatever your federal issue is, go down and talk. I've been to that office before, and I don't even live in this district. So go talk to people. And make sure you're registered to vote. Tennessee was 50th out of the states in the 2016 election in voter turnout. 50th out of 50. And 2 years earlier, we were 49th. Only Texas was worse than us. So we have to do a better job in this state. That's pathetic.
We're getting ready to announce there's a new initiative from the highest level at our university to try to get 100% of MTSU students registered to vote. And I must tell you that in my own classes, I have plenty of students who really don't want to register to vote. I have yet to fathom that. So I think it's up for you all to speak to your peers and understand that you've got the power, you've got the voice, and you really need to darn well get registered. It could not be easier. It's because we just, since September now, have this online registration. If you live on campus, it's a smidge complicated. If you live here in Rutherford County, but you're from, say, Shelby or Knox, you can absolutely register and vote right here in Rutherford County. You are welcome to do so, and you're legally able to do so. Even keeping your driver's license back from Carroll County, you can register and vote here. And there's some, if you live in the dorms, there's a little quirk to it, but go to the American Democracy Project MTSU website and it'll talk you through how to do it. Just, you can do it on your phone this afternoon if you're not already registered.
I've heard some people say, oh, I'll get called for jury duty. Well, first off, it's not that bad. And secondly, they do pay you. It's not a lot, but you still get like $5 in the lunch. So, but jury duty is not something to fear. I've been through it 3 times and I'm still walking.
I was going to say, I've only been through it once. They won't call me anymore because I'm a university professor and I ask too many questions. So that's one way to get out of it. Start immediately saying, I don't think you have enough evidence here to proceed. I need to discuss this. And they'll go, okay, we don't want that person. And they'll dismiss you. So bring your intellect.
Yeah, one time I was doing voir dire on a case that involved a 10-year grievance. And I said, you sure you want me on this one? Because I've sort of been on both sides of that issue. Yes.
One thing I'm curious about, from your vantage point, what are some of the ways that the struggle for LGBT rights intersect and immigration rights?
Oh, a lot of immigrants do come to this country from who are LGBTQ to avoid persecution and harassment. A lot of times they're physically beaten, even by police. Ironically, I just saw the brand new movie, A Fantastic Woman, last night. And that's set in Chile, and she faced a lot of coldness and hostility. She wasn't physically beaten by the cops, but that does happen in many countries. So they flee, and many of them, because they, to get a visa, you got to go to like the consulate, you got to get your local sheriff to approve it or whatever, and they're not going to do that, and so they just flee, hoping to slide under the radar and find a better life free of harassment And so the LGBT community is solidly supporting the immigrant community on federal and state legislation, including tuition equality, which would allow undocumented immigrants from that dreamer generation to go to colleges and universities in Tennessee on Tennessee resident tuition, not out-of-state tuition, which is like $2,000 or $3,000 higher, whatever the figure. And so there is unity specifically on that in Tennessee, and broader immigration reform and support for the dreamers all over the country, because there is definite overlap. I actually met a young woman, trans woman, and her male partner from in Cookeville, and they were hired by a company there, and so since they had fled, I guess it was Mexico, they didn't have documentation, so the company worked with them to get them IDs, which made them vulnerable to identification fraud, and they were caught, sadly, because the boyfriend who was driving a car didn't have a driver's license and he had had a couple of beers. So they discovered this lack of ID situation, or the fact that they had these sort of falsified documents. So suddenly they were facing deportation back to Mexico for ID fraud, because that's a felony. DUI is a misdemeanor, but that was a felony, and ICE was ready to take them and send them back, where they potentially could have been killed. And so a lot of people got together and tried to work, although most of the, especially in Cookeville, what few immigration lawyers they have are not experienced with LGBT people, and most of the LGBT lawyers who are concentrated in Nashville don't have a lot of experience on immigration issues. And so trying to get these groups of attorneys together to figure out how to help that particular couple was a challenge. I think finally the DA just said, you know, I don't care about that. Just don't drink and drive again. So they let them out, and they're allowed to stay. And they didn't want to expose the company because that could have brought down their operations. And it's a big employer in Cookeville. Anyone else? Anything else? Are we out of time? Or?
Thank you, Dr. Richmond.
Thank you.